Marcus Thorne stood at his office window on the 40th floor of Denver's glass-wrapped Morrison Tower, watching storm clouds gather over the Rockies. At 52, he'd built everything he'd dreamed of, a thriving investment firm, a sprawling ranch-style home in Cherry Creek, and a family that was the envy of his social circle. Or so he thought. His phone buzzed again, another message from his brother James. "You need to know the truth, Mark. Call me." He'd been getting these cryptic texts for weeks now, each one more urgent than the last. James had always been the dramatic one, prone to conspiracies and wild theories. But something about this felt different. Marcus ran his hand over his silver-streaked hair, a gesture that had become more frequent lately. The quarterly reports on his desk showed record profits, but they couldn't quiet the gnawing unease that had taken root in his gut. Claire, his wife of 28 years, had been acting strange lately, mysterious phone calls, sudden business trips, and a new password on her phone that appeared 3 months ago. "Mr. Thorne." His assistant's voice crackled through the intercom. "Your son Ryan is here to see you." Ryan. His 24-year-old son, who'd chosen to work his way up from the mailroom rather than accept an executive position. A decision Marcus had secretly admired, even as Claire called it foolish. "Send him in, Sandra." The door opened, and Ryan entered, his usual confident stride replaced by something more hesitant. "Dad, we need to talk." He clutched a manila envelope in his hands, knuckles white against the pale paper. "It's about Mom and Uncle James." Marcus felt his chest tighten. "What about them?" "I overheard something at the Chapman party last weekend. Then I started digging." Ryan's voice cracked slightly. "Dad, I think they're planning something. Something big. And it involves the firm's offshore accounts." The storm clouds outside had reached the city now, casting the office in premature darkness. Thunder rolled in the distance as Marcus took the envelope from his son's trembling hands. Inside, he found bank statements, email printouts, and photographs, so many photographs. Each one felt like a punch to the gut. "There's more," Ryan said, his voice barely a whisper. "Aunt Sarah's accident last year." "I don't think it was an accident at all." Marcus sank into his leather chair, the weight of decades of trust crumbling around him. Sarah, Claire's sister, had been like a second mother to Ryan. Her death in a hiking accident had devastated their family. Or at least, most of their family. Now that he thought about it, Claire's grief had seemed performed. "How long have you been investigating this?" Marcus asked, spreading the documents across his desk. 3 months. Ever since I saw Mom meeting with that lawyer in Boulder. The one who handled the merger with Chapman Industries." Ryan leaned forward, his young face etched with worry. "Dad, there's something else. I think Uncle James isn't trying to warn you. I think he's trying to threaten you. Look at the timestamp on those photos." Marcus checked the dates. The photographs of Claire and James together had been taken years ago, long before Sarah's death. But they told a story that made his blood run cold. A story of betrayal that went deeper than he could have imagined. The intercom crackled again. "Mr. Thorne. Mrs. Thorne is here for your lunch appointment." Marcus and Ryan exchanged glances. Through the glass walls of his office, they could see Claire approaching, elegant as always in her tailored suit, her smile practiced and perfect. Too perfect. "Ryan," Marcus said quietly, sliding the envelope into his desk drawer, "I need you to do something for me. Don't tell anyone about this. Not yet. I need time to figure out what we're dealing with." "What about the board meeting next week?" "Mom and Uncle James have been pushing for that vote on restructuring the international division." Thunder cracked overhead, closer now. Claire was almost at the door. "Son," Marcus said, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands, "I think it's time we had a family dinner. This Sunday. Invite your sister Emma too. But don't tell your mother I asked you to." Ryan nodded, understanding the unspoken message. As he turned to leave, passing his mother in the doorway, Marcus watched the interplay of their expressions. Claire's smile remained fixed, but her eyes followed her son with a predator's focus. "Darling," she said, closing the door behind her, "I hope I'm not interrupting anything important. James called this morning. He had the most interesting suggestion about the Chapman account." Marcus felt the weight of his wedding ring, suddenly foreign against his skin. In that moment, as his wife of nearly 3 decades approached his desk with secrets dancing behind her eyes, he realized that the storm outside was nothing compared to the tempest gathering within the walls of his carefully constructed life. The Sunday dinner table had always been Claire's stage. Tonight, the crystal gleamed, the silver sparkled, and the tension hung thick as smoke in the air. Marcus watched his wife move through their kitchen with practiced grace, every gesture precise, controlled, just like the empire of lies she'd built around them. Emma, their 26-year-old daughter, sat beside him at the kitchen island, absently turning her wedding ring. She'd arrived early, her usual vibrant energy dimmed. "Dad," she whispered, glancing at her mother's back, "there's something you should know about Aunt Sarah's accident." Before she could continue, Ryan arrived, bringing with him the sharp Colorado evening air and a guest that made Claire's spatula clatter against the stovetop. "Hope you don't mind," he said, his voice carefully neutral. "I ran into Detective Michael Chen at the gym. He mentioned he knew Aunt Sarah from her volunteer work at the crisis center." Marcus caught the fraction of a second crack in Claire's composure, a slight tightening around her eyes, a momentary stillness in her shoulders. He'd seen that look before, at Sarah's funeral, when the detective had tried to ask her questions about the hiking trail. "Detective," Claire recovered smoothly, "what an unexpected pleasure. Though I'm afraid we only set the table for family." "Please," Marcus stood, extending his hand to the detective, "join us. We have plenty to share." He emphasized the last word, watching his wife's reflection in the window. "After all, Sarah always said there was room at our table for one more." The detective's handshake was firm, his dark eyes sharp beneath their professional warmth. "Thank you, Mr. Thorne." Sarah spoke often about these Sunday dinners. As they settled around the dining room table, Marcus noticed how the seating had naturally divided them, himself, Ryan, Emma, and Detective Chen on one side, Claire alone on the other, with James's conspicuously empty chair beside her. The roast beef she'd prepared, Sarah's recipe, sat untouched between them. "Before we eat," Emma said suddenly, her voice stronger than it had been in months, "I want to talk about what really happened at Chapman Industries during the merger." Claire's knife scraped against fine china. "Darling, business talk can wait. Tonight is about family." "That's exactly why we need to discuss it," Ryan joined in. "Because family is about trust. And truth." He pulled out his phone, placing it on the table. "I found Sarah's voice memos, Mom. All of them." The color drained from Claire's face. "What voice memos?" Detective Chen leaned forward slightly. "Mrs. Thorne, Sarah contacted me 3 days before her death. She wanted to discuss certain financial irregularities she'd discovered while auditing the Chapman merger documents." "I don't know what you're implying," Claire's voice was ice, "but my sister's death was a tragic accident. The investigation confirmed that." "The initial investigation, yes," Chen agreed. "But we've reopened the case based on new evidence. Evidence that Sarah left with her daughter, your niece, Jessica." Marcus watched his wife's hands, always so steady, tremble slightly as she reached for her wine glass. "Jessica? She hasn't spoken to any of us since the funeral." "Actually, Mom," Emma's voice cracked, "she has. She's been staying with me for the past month. She found something in Aunt Sarah's safety deposit box. Something about you and Uncle James." The silence that followed was deafening. Outside, a car door slammed, and Claire's head snapped toward the sound. Marcus recognized the look in her eyes, a cornered animal, calculating escape routes. It's over, Claire, Marcus said quietly. James called me this morning. He's agreed to testify about everything, the embezzlement, the offshore accounts, and what really happened on that hiking trail. Claire's laugh was brittle. James? You're trusting James? The same brother who betrayed you with the Stanley account in '98. Oh, Marcus. She stood, smoothing her napkin with trembling fingers. You have no idea what you're dealing with. What I've done to protect this family. Protect us. Ryan's voice rose. Like you protected Aunt Sarah? You don't understand, Claire's composure cracked completely. Sarah was going to ruin everything. The life I built for us, the opportunities one created for you children. She was always the perfect one, the ethical one. She didn't understand that sometimes you have to get your hands dirty to protect what matters. Mrs. Thorne, Detective Chen said quietly, I need you to stay seated. But Claire was already moving, her hand diving into her purse. What she pulled out made Emma gasp, a small USB drive on a familiar keychain, the one Sarah had always carried. You want the truth? Claire's voice was almost unrecognizable. Here it is. Every transaction, every decision, every sacrifice I made. But remember this, I'm not the only one with secrets in this family. Her eyes locked onto Marcus. Should we tell the children about what really happened to their grandfather's fortune? About the choice you made that summer in Aspen? The sound of footsteps in the foyer cut through the tension. James appeared in the doorway, his face grave. Behind him stood Jessica, Sarah's daughter, clutching a manila envelope identical to the one Ryan had brought to Marcus's office. Claire's smile turned feral. Well, well. The prodigal brother returns. Tell me, James, did you explain to Marcus why you really sent those warning messages? Or should I? Thunder rolled outside, an echo of the storm brewing within the Thorne family's carefully constructed facade. As Marcus looked around the table at the faces of his children, his brother, and his wife of 28 years, he realized that dinner was just the beginning. The real feast would be the truth, and it promised to be a bitter meal indeed. Jessica stood in her aunt's pristine dining room, her mother's envelope clutched to her chest like a shield. At 28, she was the spitting image of Sarah, the same gentle eyes, the same quiet strength. But tonight, there was steel in her stance as she faced the woman who had orchestrated her mother's death. I found Mom's journals, Jessica's voice was steady, though her hands trembled. Every conversation, every threat, every manipulation you used to keep her quiet. She documented everything, Aunt Claire. She knew you might try to silence her, so she made sure the truth would survive. Claire remained standing, the USB drive dangling from her fingers like a poison chalice. Your mother was always so methodical. Even as children, she kept her diary locked away, recording every perceived slight, every little injustice. Her laugh was hollow. Did those journals tell you about the summer she stole my first love? About how she always had to be the moral compass, the perfect daughter, while I did what was necessary to secure our family's future. Stop it. Emma's voice cracked like a whip. Stop trying to justify what you did. Aunt Sarah figured out you were embezzling millions through the Chapman merger. She was going to expose you, so you arranged her accident. Marcus watched the interplay of emotions across his wife's face, rage, fear, and something deeper, more wounded. In 28 years of marriage, he'd never seen past her perfect facade. Now it was crumbling before his eyes, revealing the damaged soul beneath. You don't understand what it was like, Claire's voice took on a desperate edge. Growing up in Sarah's shadow, always the flawed sister, the one who had to fight for every scrap of attention. When I married Marcus, I finally had something that was mine. I built this life, this legacy. I wouldn't let her destroy it. Detective Chen moved slowly around the table, but James stepped forward first. Tell them the rest, Claire. Tell them about the other deaths. About Stanley Richards in '98, about Peter Chapman's convenient heart attack last year. Tell them how deep this really goes. Claire's eyes darted to the windows, to the doors, seeking escape. You're one to talk about truth, James. Should I tell Marcus about the real reason you've been sending those warnings? About your own involvement in the Chapman merger? I was weak, James admitted, his face haggard with guilt. You manipulated me, used my gambling debts as leverage. But Sarah, she helped me see the truth. She was helping me gather evidence against you when. When what, Uncle James? Ryan demanded. What really happened on that trail? The silence that followed was suffocating. Jessica opened the envelope with trembling fingers, pulling out a stack of photographs. Mom was wearing a hidden camera that day. She knew Aunt Claire had asked to meet her for a hike. She wasn't taking any chances. The photos spilled across the dining table like accusing fingers. Claire, confronting Sarah on the narrow trail. The struggle. The push. Sarah's last photo, Claire's face contorted with a mixture of triumph and horror as her sister plummeted toward the rocks below. Emma let out a choked sob. Marcus felt the world tilt beneath his feet as decades of memories realigned themselves, revealing the monster who had shared his bed, raised his children, all while orchestrating a web of destruction around them. I did it for us, Claire whispered, but her eyes were wild now, darting between the faces of her family. Everything I did was to protect what we built. Marcus, you of all people should understand. What you did in Aspen was a mistake I've regretted every day since. Marcus cut her off. A mistake I confessed to the authorities years ago. The money I took from my father, I paid it all back. But you've been playing a longer game, haven't you? How many others, Claire? How many lives have you destroyed to maintain your perfect image? Claire's hand disappeared into her purse again, but this time she withdrew something that made Detective Chen draw his weapon, a small revolver, its pearl handle gleaming in the dining room light. Mom, no. Emma's scream pierced the air. Put the gun down, Mrs. Thorne, Chen commanded, but Claire's smile had turned eerily peaceful. You want to know the truth about Aspen? She asked, her voice almost dreamy. About why your father really cut you out of his will, Marcus? About who really suggested you borrow that money? She laughed, a sound like breaking glass. I arranged everything. Every crisis, every solution. I made you dependent on me, all of you. And now. The sound of police sirens wailed in the distance, growing closer. James stepped protectively in front of Jessica, while Ryan moved toward his sister. Marcus found himself unable to move, transfixed by the stranger wearing his wife's face. Claire, he said softly, all these years, was any of it real? Her answer was cut off by the sound of breaking glass. Through the kitchen window, a flash of movement caught everyone's attention, a figure in black, moving with purpose. Claire's eyes widened in recognition, and for the first time that evening, genuine fear crossed her face. You don't understand, she whispered, no longer speaking to her family. He wasn't supposed to be here. Not tonight. Not yet. The gun in her hand trembled as she backed toward the study. Outside, the sirens grew closer, and the shadow in the garden moved again. Detective Chen kept his weapon trained on Claire, but his eyes tracked the movement outside with growing concern. In that moment of chaos, as his family's world imploded around him, Marcus realized that the evening's revelations were just the beginning. There were darker truths still lurking in the shadows of their perfect life, waiting to emerge. And somewhere in the garden, watching through the broken window, was someone who knew them all. Through the fractured window, a gust of cold mountain air swept into the dining room, carrying with it the scent of pine and approaching rain. Emma reached for her brother's hand, finding strength in the familiar calluses and warmth that reminded her of childhood afternoons spent climbing trees together, back when their world still made sense. Drop the gun, Claire. The voice from the garden was quiet but carried the weight of years of buried truth. A man stepped through the broken window, his silver hair catching the dining room light. Peter Chapman, very much alive and nothing like the frail victim of a supposed heart attack their mother had described. Claire's composure cracked completely. "You're dead." "I made sure, I saw." "You saw what I wanted you to see," Peter said, moving carefully into the room. "Sarah and I had already figured out your plan. The heart attack, the falsified death certificate, everything. She helped me disappear until we could gather enough evidence." Detective Chen kept his weapon trained on Claire but nodded slightly to Peter. "Mr. Chapman has been working with us for months. Sarah's death forced us to accelerate our timeline." Jessica stepped forward, her mother's journal clutched to her chest. Mom knew she was in danger, but she refused to stop. "The night before the hike, she told me, sometimes loving someone means being brave enough to save them from themselves." Marcus watched his wife's face contort with a mixture of rage and desperation. In that moment, he saw past the perfect mask she'd worn for decades, past the calculated manipulation, to the wounded soul beneath. It didn't excuse her actions, but it helped him understand the weight of responsibility he carried for not seeing the truth sooner. "All those years," he said softly, "I thought I was protecting our family by looking the other way. By believing your explanations, accepting your versions of events. I failed our children, Claire. I failed Sarah. But most of all, I failed you by enabling this poison to grow." Emma moved to her father's side, her hand finding his shoulder. "Dad, this isn't your fault. Mom's been playing all of us against each other for years. Even Grandpa's death. Tell them, Claire," Peter's voice hardened. "Tell them about Richard Thorne's last days. About the medications you switched, the documents you forged. Tell them why Sarah really started investigating you." Claire's laugh was hollow, eerily childlike. "Poor, sweet Sarah. Always trying to save everyone. She never understood that some people don't want to be saved. Some people need to burn it all down to feel alive." Her finger tightened on the trigger. "Did she tell you about the fire at the summer house? About what really happened to Mom?" "Mom, please," Ryan's voice cracked with emotion. "Just stop. No more deaths. No more lies." The gun in Claire's hand wavered as she looked at her son, really looked at him, for perhaps the first time in years. "You have her eyes, you know. My mother's eyes. She never approved of my methods either. Always taking Sarah's side, always pushing me to be better. Until that night at the lake house. The insurance investigation," James cut in, his face pale. "The electrical fire that killed your mother. Sarah discovered the truth about that too, didn't she? That's why you had to silence her." Lightning flashed outside, illuminating Claire's face in stark relief. In that moment, she looked ancient and terribly young at the same time, a lost child wrapped in a monster's skin. "She said she wanted to help me. To get me treatment. As if I was sick. As if protecting this family, building this legacy, was some kind of illness." Jessica stepped closer, her mother's journal extended like an olive branch. "She did want to help you, Aunt Claire. Look." She opened the journal to a marked page, reading Sarah's words aloud. "My sister is drowning in darkness she mistakes for strength. Every act of cruelty is a cry for help she can't voice. I have to try one more time to reach her, even if it costs me everything." The words seemed to hit Claire like physical blows. The gun drooped in her hand as tears, real tears, perhaps the first genuine emotion they'd seen from her in years, spilled down her cheeks. She always had to be so perfect. So understanding. Even at the end, on that trail, she tried to hug me. To tell me she forgave me. As if I wanted her forgiveness. "But you did," Emma said softly. "You do. That's why you kept her hiking boots. Why you wear her perfume sometimes when you think no one's around. Why you still set a place for her at family dinners. Claire's carefully constructed walls began to crumble. Behind her, through the broken window, more shadows moved in the garden, police tactical units taking position. The sirens had stopped, but red and blue lights painted the walls in alternating waves of judgment. "Mrs. Thorne," Detective Chen said quietly, "we have the house surrounded. But this can end differently. Sarah would want." "Don't." Claire's grip tightened on the gun again. "Don't you dare tell me what Sarah would want. She's dead. I killed her. I killed my own sister, my best friend, the only person who ever really." Her voice broke. "The only person who ever really saw me." As if summoned by those words, another figure appeared at the dining room doorway. A small woman with silver-streaked hair and tired eyes that had seen too much. Dr. Elizabeth Chen, Detective Chen's wife and, more importantly, the therapist who had been working with Sarah in the months before her death. "Hello, Claire," Dr. Chen said gently. "Sarah left something with me. Something she wanted you to have, if it ever came to this." She held out a sealed envelope, yellowed with age. "She wrote this the day after your mother died. She knew, even then, that you were hurting. That you needed help, not judgment." The gun in Claire's hand trembled violently as she stared at the envelope. Outside, thunder rolled across the mountains, and the first heavy drops of rain began to fall through the broken window. In that moment, suspended between violence and vulnerability, the Thorne family held its collective breath, waiting to see which path Claire would choose, redemption or destruction. The answer, when it came, would change them all forever. The letter trembled in Claire's hands, Sarah's familiar handwriting blurring through her tears. The gun had slipped from her fingers moments before, clattering to the hardwood floor where Detective Chen had swiftly secured it. Now, surrounded by the family she'd simultaneously protected and destroyed, she began to read aloud. "My dearest Claire. If you're reading this, I've failed to save you in life, but perhaps these words can reach you in death. I remember the night Mom died, how you collapsed in my arms, whispering I had to do it over and over. I should have understood then that your pain wasn't a moment, but an ocean, drowning you slowly over years. You were 13 when Dad first raised his hand to Mom, 15 when he turned that rage on you. I was the lucky one, the invisible child, watching helplessly as you transformed yourself into someone hard enough to survive. What I saw as manipulation, you saw as protection. What I called cruelty, you knew as strength. But sister, the armor you built is killing you, just as surely as it killed Mom." Claire's voice broke. Emma moved instinctively toward her mother, but Ryan caught her arm, his own tears falling freely. They watched as their mother, this stranger they'd lived with all their lives, crumpled to her knees, still clutching Sarah's letter. Dr. Chen knelt beside her, keeping a careful distance. "Your sister understood trauma, Claire. She spent the last years of her life studying it, trying to understand how to help you. Those therapy sessions she attended weren't for herself." Marcus felt the weight of decades of blindness crushing his chest. "The business trips to Boulder," he whispered. "She was meeting with you, wasn't she? Not lovers, not conspirators. She was trying to find a way to save her sister." James stepped forward, his face haunted. "Sarah approached me 6 months before she died. She showed me Mom's old journals, helped me understand the patterns we were all trapped in. Claire, she knew about the lake house. About how Mom made you promise to be strong enough for both of us before she swallowed those pills." Claire's voice was barely audible. "Before she chose to leave us with him. I promised her I'd never be weak, never let anyone hurt us again. But all I did was become him." Jessica moved slowly to her aunt's side, kneeling with her mother's journal open. "Mom wrote about that night too. About finding you in the garden, about how you begged her not to call the police. She didn't understand then, but later she wrote, Claire's greatest tragedy isn't the lives she's taken, but the light she had to extinguish within herself to survive." Through the broken window, the storm had begun to ease, the violence of thunder giving way to gentle rain. Detective Chen spoke quietly into his radio, standing down the tactical team outside. In the sudden quiet, Claire's ragged breathing filled the room. "I can still feel her arms around me," she whispered. "On the trail. I was so angry, so afraid she'd destroy everything I'd built. But she just held me. Like when we were girls. Like nothing had changed." Her hands shook as she turned to the next page of Sarah's letter. She knew, didn't she? Even then, she knew what I'd become. She knew who you could still be, Dr. Chen said gently. That's why she documented everything. Not just the crimes, but the pain behind them. The moments of connection, the glimpses of the sister she never stopped loving. She created a path for you, Claire. A way back to yourself. Emma finally broke free from Ryan's grip, crossing the room to kneel before her mother. With trembling fingers, she reached out and touched Claire's hand, the first real contact they'd had in years. "Mom, I found Grandma's journals too. In the lake house attic. I understand now, about the fire, about everything. And I don't forgive you. Not yet. But I want to understand. I want to know my real mother, not the perfect mask you created." Claire stared at her daughter's hand on hers as if seeing it for the first time. "I don't know how to be real anymore," she whispered. "I've been this thing for so long. This monster wearing your mother's face." "Then let us help you find your way back," Marcus said, his voice rough with emotion. "Not for forgiveness, not yet. But for truth. For Sarah. For the family we could still become." Peter Chapman stepped forward, placing a thick file on the dining room table. "The evidence doesn't go away, Claire. There will be consequences. But Sarah left us a roadmap, not just to justice, but to healing. The question is, are you brave enough to face yourself without the armor?" The rain outside had softened to a whisper, and through the broken window, the first hints of dawn began to paint the Colorado sky. Claire looked down at her sister's letter, at the last words written in Sarah's flowing hand. "When you're ready to lay down your weapons, when the weight of this armor becomes too much to bear, remember this: I saw you, sister. Behind the masks, beneath the scars. I saw the light you locked away to survive. It's still there, waiting. And so am I, in the love I've left behind in our children, in these words, in the truth that will finally set you free." In the growing light of morning, surrounded by the wreckage of her carefully constructed life, Claire Thorne began the hardest journey of all, the long walk home to herself. 1 year later, the garden at the Thorne family ranch bloomed with late summer flowers, Sarah's favorites. Marcus sat on the weathered bench beneath the old maple tree, watching as Jessica and Emma worked together, their hands deep in the rich soil their aunt had once tended. The morning light caught the silver charm bracelet on Jessica's wrist, Sarah's last gift to her daughter, found in the safety deposit box alongside the evidence that had changed their lives forever. Through the kitchen window, he could see Ryan preparing breakfast, moving with the same quiet determination that had carried him through the past year's storms. The trial, the media circus, the painful process of untangling decades of financial deception, his son had faced it all with a strength that reminded Marcus painfully of Sarah. "The irises are blooming early this year," James said, settling beside his brother on the bench. The past year had aged him, but there was a peace in his eyes that spoke of hard-won wisdom. Sarah always said they were Claire's favorite, even if she pretended to prefer roses. Marcus nodded, his thoughts drifting to the minimum security facility in Boulder where Claire was serving her reduced sentence. Dr. Chen's testimony about generational trauma, combined with Claire's full cooperation in unraveling the financial crimes, had swayed the judge toward mercy. But the real punishment, they all knew, was the weight of truth she now carried. "I got another letter from her yesterday," Marcus said quietly. "She's continuing the therapy. Learning to paint," she said. His voice caught. She said she finally dreamed about Sarah without waking in tears. Emma looked up from her gardening, soil smudged on her cheek. Mom's therapist says that's progress. That nightmares changing to dreams means the mind is learning to process trauma differently. She'd begun studying psychology herself, turning her own healing journey into a path to help others. It's strange, Jessica added, sitting back on her heels. Sometimes I catch myself feeling angry at Mom for taking away my chance to help Aunt Claire. She knew, you know. She knew the darkness was consuming her sister, but she never gave up hope. Even that day on the trail. Ryan emerged from the kitchen carrying a tray of coffee mugs, Sarah's old pottery, each one uniquely imperfect. I've been thinking about what Mom said during her testimony. About how Grandma made her promise to be strong, to protect the family at any cost. How do we learn to be strong without becoming hard? Perhaps, a new voice joined them, strength isn't about being hard or soft. It's about being whole. Dr. Chen walked through the garden gate, her silver hair catching the morning light. She'd become more than a therapist to the family, she was a bridge between the past they were learning to face and the future they were struggling to build. Claire asked me to share something with you all, she continued, settling onto the grass beside Emma. In our last session, she said, I spent my life building walls to protect us from a danger that lived inside me. Sarah spent her life building bridges. She knew that real protection comes from connection, not isolation. Marcus felt tears press against his eyes. She's starting to sound like herself. The self I glimpsed sometimes, in quiet moments, before the masks took over. Healing isn't linear, Dr. Chen reminded them gently. Claire's journey will have setbacks, moments when the armor feels safer than vulnerability. But she's learning to trust the process, just as you all are. Jessica stood, brushing dirt from her knees. I found more of Mom's journals last week, from when we were kids. She wrote about a conversation with Aunt Claire, right after I was born. She wrote, for a moment, holding Jessica, all of Claire's walls fell away. She looked at me with such raw love, such terror at feeling so much. I saw my sister then, the real Claire, desperate to protect not just from danger, but from the pain of caring too deeply. I remember that day, James said softly. Claire cried when she held you, Jess. The only time I ever saw her cry, until the night everything changed, Ryan finished. He set the coffee tray on the old garden table Sarah had restored years ago. But maybe that's not quite right. Maybe she was crying all along, just, on the inside. Like Mom wrote in her letter, crying out for help in the only language she knew. Emma reached for a coffee mug, her hands steady despite the weight of memory. I visited her last week. She started a garden in the facility yard. Small things, herbs, wildflowers. She told me. Emma's voice wavered. She told me she finally understands why Sarah loved growing things. How healing comes from nurturing life instead of controlling it. The morning sun had risen fully now, painting the garden in warm light. A butterfly, brilliant blue, Sarah's favorite color, landed on one of the irises Claire had planted decades ago. Marcus watched it, remembering all the beautiful things his wife had created, not just the destruction she'd caused. We're all works in progress, Dr. Chen said, accepting a coffee mug from Ryan. Claire's actions caused profound harm, and that can't be undone. But Sarah understood something vital, that healing requires us to hold space for both justice and compassion. For accountability and understanding. She left us a map, Jessica said, touching her mother's charm bracelet. Not just to uncover the truth, but to find our way back to each other. Back to ourselves. Marcus stood, walking to the flower bed where his daughter and niece had been working. Kneeling in the soil, he helped them plant the last of Sarah's beloved irises. In the distance, storm clouds gathered over the mountains, not threatening now, but promising the rain needed for new growth. Claire has her first supervised day pass next month, he said quietly. She wants to visit Sarah's grave, then come here, to the garden. To face everything she built and everything she destroyed. To begin again. The family fell silent, each lost in their own thoughts of endings and beginnings, of wounds and healing, of the long path ahead. Above them, the old maple tree rustled in the morning breeze, its leaves whispering secrets of resilience, of survival, of the quiet strength found in facing truth together. And in that moment, in Sarah's garden, surrounded by the flowers she'd loved and the family she'd died protecting, they felt it, the first fragile shoots of something new taking root. Not forgiveness, not yet. But understanding. Hope. The promise of dawn after the longest night. The journey ahead would not be easy. There would be storms to weather, trust to rebuild, wounds that might never fully heal. But they had Sarah's wisdom to guide them, Claire's hard-won truth to ground them, and each other to lean on when the path grew steep. It was enough. It had to be enough. In the growing light of morning, the Thorne family began again.